Do you fear that your legacy will vanish the moment your heart stops? That the world will simply overwrite your existence? In this chronicle of obsession, you will learn the terrifying price of true immortality and the art of never being forgotten. The needle hissed as it pierced the cold, gray dermis of the Duke of Roxburgh's neck. In the sterile silence of the Mayfair basement, Sebastian Thorne didn't breathe. He was a ghost, haunting a ghost. His icy blue eyes were fixed on the microscopic gap between the stitches, his pale, steady hands moving with a grace that bordered on the divine. The scent of formaldehyde and expensive cologne hung heavy in the air. He wasn't just preparing a body for a funeral. He was curating a final moment of dignity. But as he looked at the Duke's peaceful, slack expression, a surge of revulsion hit him. Peace was a lie. Peace was boring. The Duke should look like he was still holding on to the secrets of the crown. He should look triumphant, even in the grip of the void. Sebastian's fingers drifted to a set of specialized silver scalpels he'd forged himself. He began to wonder, what if the dead didn't have to look dead? The rhythm of the city changed outside, the distant sirens of Scotland Yard growing louder, more frequent. They were asking questions about the missing debutantes, the ones who had entered Thorne's parlor and never emerged for their viewings. Sebastian didn't panic. He simply adjusted his charcoal silk cravat. He looked at the Duke one last time, then at the empty crates waiting in the shadows. He had already begun the process of liquefying his London assets. The aristocrats wanted preservation, but the Americans in the desert, they wanted a show. He wiped a stray drop of blood from his silver tie-pin. It was time to trade the fog of the Thames for the neon rot of the Mojave. He wasn't running. He was evolving. The world needed a curator who understood that the only thing more beautiful than life was the moment it was stolen and frozen forever. 10 years later, the heat of Las Vegas screamed against the pavement, but 30 feet beneath the ruins of the Sahara Casino, the air was a constant, chilling 55 degrees. Sebastian, now known only as the Curator, stood before his latest acquisition, a young showgirl whose name had already been erased from the billboards upstairs. She was strapped to a hydraulic chair, her eyes wide, darting, wet with a terror that Sebastian found intoxicating. He leaned in close, his aquiline nose nearly touching hers. "Don't cry, my dear," he whispered, his voice a smooth, British baritone that felt like a razor against skin. "Tears ruin the polymer's adhesion. You are about to become the center of a room that billionaires will pay a king's ransom to enter. You aren't dying. You are being promoted." He picked up a surgical probe, the light from the neon tubes above reflecting in his icy blue eyes. The procedure was a symphony of precision. With the practiced ease of a man who had dissected the elite of London, Sebastian located the facial nerves. One snip, and the girl's ability to scream vanished, replaced by a permanent, ecstatic grin that didn't reach her pleading eyes. He began the injection, the warm, liquid polymer that would replace her blood, hardening her from the inside out while her brain remained firing, trapped in a cage of her own calcifying flesh. He stepped back, admiring the way the neon purple light hit her high cheekbones. She was a masterpiece of agony masked by joy. Upstairs, the slot machines chimed and the tourists gambled away their lives, oblivious to the fact that below them, a man from Mayfair was building a cathedral of silent, smiling screams. The curator straightened his vest, checked his pocket watch, and prepared to welcome his first guest of the evening. The show was just beginning. The subterranean air of the Wax Museum was a pressurized vacuum of silence, thick with the chemical tang of stabilizing agents and the cloying sweetness of expensive lilies. Sebastian Thorne moved through the shadows of the decommissioned Sahara vault like a cold front, his charcoal Savile Row suit absorbing the flickering violet neon that bled from the ceiling. Tonight was the vernissage of the damned, an event for the world's most depraved apex predators who had grown bored with traditional vices. Standing at the center of the room was his newest acquisition, the showgirl Elena. Her body arched in a perpetual dance of joy, her skin glistening under a layer of micro-wax. The stakes were higher than they had ever been in London. These American billionaires didn't just pay for art, they paid for the impossible. If a single statue so much as blinked, or if the polymer began to cloud, the reputation he had built on the bones of the British aristocracy would vanish, replaced by the lethal wrath of men who owned private armies. Sebastian adjusted his silver tie pin, his icy blue eyes scanning the room with the predatory precision of a hawk, feeling the weight of the secret he carried. The polymer was beginning to react unpredictably with the Nevada heat, and his masterpieces were starting to rot from the inside out while remaining conscious. The impasse manifested in a subtle, rhythmic twitch in Elena's left eyelid, a neurological rebellion that no amount of Victorian nerve severing could fully extinguish. Sebastian leaned in, ostensibly to polish her shoulder with a silk handkerchief, but his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his lean ribs. He could feel the eyes of Julian Sterling, a Silicon Valley titan with a penchant for hyper-realism, burning into his back. To fix the twitch, Sebastian would need to administer a second dose of the stabilizing agent directly into the carotid artery. But doing so in a room full of witnesses was a death sentence. The girl's eyes, those wet, living orbs trapped in a face of stone, seemed to scream at him, begging for the release of death or the mercy of discovery. He couldn't kill her. It would be a waste of a perfect specimen. And he couldn't let her live in this half-state without the twitch exposing his fraud. The perfectionist in him was paralyzed by the friction between his artistic obsession and the biological reality of the human nervous system's refusal to surrender. "Your attention to detail is unsettling, Curator," Sterling remarked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls as he circled Elena like a shark. He leaned so close that his breath fogged the wax coating her cheek. Sebastian stood his ground, his 6'1" frame casting a long, intimidating shadow. He didn't flinch, his thin lips pulled into a mask of professional indifference that hid a growing vortex of panic. He spoke in a smooth, British baritone, weaving a lie about the kinetic memory of the sculptures, a revolutionary technique he claimed to have invented to simulate the vibrancy of life. But the lie felt thin, like the translucent skin on his own hands. The conflict was no longer just about the art. It was about the crumbling wall between his past in Mayfair and his present in Vegas. If the elite discovered that his statues were actually living, breathing humans in a state of permanent locked-in syndrome, the scandal would be global. Yet, the more they suspected, the more they were willing to pay, creating a trap of his own design where the only way to fund his escape was to deepen his descent into depravity. As the gala reached its zenith, a sharp, haptic vibration pulsed against Sebastian's wrist. He glanced down at his vintage Patek Philippe, which had been modified to sync with the vault's perimeter sensors. A red dot blinked on the digital overlay hidden beneath the crystal. Someone had bypassed the 3-stage biometric lock at the casino level, someone who didn't use a guest invite. Sebastian's gaze flicked to the security monitor hidden behind a velvet curtain, and his blood turned to liquid nitrogen. In the grainy, low-light feed of the service elevator, a figure stood motionless, staring directly into the camera lens. The man wore a trench coat that looked out of place in the desert heat, and his hand rested on a holster that bore the distinct markings of the British Intelligence Service. The ghost of London had finally crossed the Atlantic. Sebastian looked back at the room full of monsters and his gallery of smiling corpses, realizing that the vault he had built to be his sanctuary had just become a high-tech coffin with no exit. The hydraulic hiss of the vault door echoed like a dying breath through the subterranean gallery, a sound that sliced through the clinking of baccarat crystal and the hushed, predatory murmurs of the elite. Sebastian Thorne didn't turn. He watched the reflection in the polished surface of a polymer-encased showgirl, her eyes frozen in a permanent, dilated state of terror that only he could truly appreciate. Behind him, The intruder stepped out of the shadows, Agent Arthur Miller, a man whose presence smelled of wet London pavement and cheap government-issue tobacco, a stark contrast to the scent of formaldehyde and expensive oud that permeated the room. Sebastian smoothed the lapel of his charcoal Savile Row jacket, his fingers steady despite the adrenaline-fueled roar in his ears, and finally turned to face the ghost of his past. "You've traveled a long way for a man who doesn't appreciate fine art, Arthur," Sebastian remarked, his British baritone as smooth as a razor's edge, eyes tracking the bulge of a suppressed Walther PPK beneath the agent's trenchcoat. The room felt smaller now, the distance between them bridged by a decade of secrets and the silent, screaming witnesses that lined the corridors like macabre pillars of salt. Miller didn't reach for the gun, not yet, but his gaze swept across the room, landing on the statue of the gambler. A young man whose skin was so translucent it looked like marble, his hand forever poised over a stack of high-stakes chips. "This isn't art, Sebastian. It's a mass grave with a cover charge," Miller spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of disgust and professional coldness that Sebastian found almost quaint. "I saw the reports from Mayfair, the empty caskets, the families burying air while their loved ones were being drained and filled with plastic in your basement, but I never imagined you'd scale it into a circus for the depraved." Sebastian stepped closer, his 6'1" frame casting a long, intimidating shadow that seemed to swallow the agent's resolve, his icy blue eyes fixed on Miller's with a predator's intensity. He explained the delicacy of the procedure, the way he severed the motor nerves while leaving the sensory pathways intact, describing the locked-in state as a form of secular immortality, where the subject becomes a perpetual observer of their own perfection. It was a clash of philosophies. The rigid morality of the crown against the boundless, cruel innovation of a man who had long since abandoned his humanity in favor of a legacy that would never decay. As the tension reached a breaking point, the elite guests began to notice the friction, their champagne-fueled laughter dying down as they sensed a different kind of entertainment unfolding. Sebastian noticed Miller's eyes flick to the dancer in repose, a figure in the corner whose eyelids were pinned back by invisible microfilaments, exposing the raw, drying whites of her eyes. The agent's face paled as he saw a single involuntary tear, a biological glitch in Sebastian's perfect design roll down the dancer's cheek, carving a path through the polymer coating. "She's still in there," Miller whispered, a realization that shattered his professional veneer, and in that moment of weakness, Sebastian saw his opening. He didn't move toward the exit. Instead, he stepped toward the central control console disguised as an antique mahogany desk, his hand hovering over a series of hidden toggles that controlled the gallery's internal defense and preservation systems. "The tragedy of your profession, Arthur, is that you seek to save those who have already been perfected," Sebastian murmured, his thin lips curling into a mask of professional indifference that masked a burgeoning manic glee. He began to recount the names of the missing, not as victims, but as acquisitions, each one a chapter in his grand American volume of suffering and beauty. Miller's hand finally moved for the holster, but the sound of half a dozen security safeties disengaging behind the velvet curtains stopped him, cold. Sebastian's private militia, recruited from the dark corners of the Vegas underworld, had arrived to protect their employer's investment. The agent was surrounded by the living, the dead, and those trapped in the agonizing space between. A scenario Sebastian had rehearsed in his mind since the day he fled London with blood on his hands and a vision in his heart. "You won't leave this room, not because I want you dead, but because you are the perfect specimen of righteous indignation, a look I've yet to capture in my collection," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he triggered the vault's lockdown sequence. The heavy steel doors ground shut, sealing the elite and the agent inside a pressurized tomb of neon and silence, while the temperature in the room began to drop, preparing the atmosphere for a new round of preservation. The hunt was over. The confrontation had reached its climax, and as the lights flickered with the surge of the polymer heating units, Sebastian Thorne knew that by dawn, he would either be a god among his creations or a frozen monument to his own madness. The first shot rang out, not from Miller, but from a panicked billionaire, and the gallery of eternal smiles was suddenly filled with the very real sound of screams. The initial gunshot was a violent puncture in the gallery's pressurized silence, a jagged tear through the velvet-lined artifice Sebastian Thorne had spent a decade perfecting. As the lead slug shattered a crystal chandelier, scattering prismatic shards like frozen tears over the panicked elite, the curator stood behind his mahogany console, his long, slender fingers moving with the rhythmic grace of a conductor guiding a symphony of screams. The emergency strobes began their rhythmic crimson pulse, bathing the room in a strobe-lit nightmare where the line between the living and the petrified blurred. Sebastian watched through the thick glass of the observation deck, his icy blue eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the orange glow of the polymer heating units as they hummed to life. He didn't see a massacre. He saw the birth of a new, grander installation, one where the terror of the American billionaire was preserved with the same clinical precision he had once used on the royalty of London. The sound of the pressurized vault doors grinding shut was the final note of the overture, sealing the agent, the victims, and the monsters inside a tomb that was rapidly becoming a kiln. Within minutes, the air inside the wax museum thickened with the cloying, bitter almond scent of the aerosolized polymer, a chemical fog that began to settle over the struggling crowd like a translucent shroud. Sebastian leaned over the railing of the mezzanine, his sharp, aquiline nose twitching as he inhaled the scent of his success, his bespoke charcoal suit pristine despite the carnage unfolding below. He watched as a billionaire real estate mogul, his face contorted in a mask of primal fear, attempted to climb over the smiling debutante statue, only for his hands to slip on the hardening resin already coating the floor. The overhead nozzles hissed, releasing a fine mist of the liquid stone that turned silk into armor and skin into marble in a matter of seconds. Agent Miller, trapped in the center of the vortex, fired 3 more rounds toward the mezzanine, the bullets sparking harmlessly against the reinforced ballistic glass protecting the curator. Sebastian merely adjusted his silver tie pin, a faint, condescending smirk touching his thin lips as he watched the agent's movements grow sluggish, the polymer beginning to fuse his boots to the floor, turning the pursuit of justice into a slow-motion struggle against an inevitable aesthetic end. You see, Arthur, the American spirit is so much more expressive when it is cornered. Sebastian's voice boomed over the intercom, a calm, cultured baritone that sliced through the cacophony of gunfire and desperate sobbing. He watched a young cocktail waitress, caught in the crossfire, as she was splashed by a direct stream of the polymer. Her body locked in a mid-scream pose, the nerves in her face cauterized by the chemical reaction into the signature. Horrific grin that was the curator's trademark. The room was becoming a forest of half-formed statues, men and women frozen in the middle of their most honest moments of cowardice and desperation, their eyes still darting wildly behind the rapidly hardening film. Sebastian felt a manic glee rising in his chest, a sense of divine purpose that London had never allowed him to fulfill. Here, in the desert, he was not just an undertaker. He was a creator of permanent truths. He watched the polymer levels rise, a clear, viscous tide that began to fill the lower levels of the gallery, threatening to turn the entire space into a solid block of amber with 100 souls trapped inside like prehistoric insects. Suddenly, a seismic tremor rocked the underground complex, the sound of a thermite explosion from the elevator shaft above signaling the arrival of Miller's MI6 extraction team. The ceiling groaned, and a cascade of desert sand and concrete debris rained down into the pristine gallery, contaminating the polymer pools with gray grit. Sebastian's face twisted, the professional mask of the curator finally shattering into a jagged display of aristocratic rage. This was an intrusion, a desecration of his magnum opus. He slammed his fist onto the console, triggering the final purge, a catastrophic release of the main polymer reservoirs intended to drown the gallery in a matter of seconds before the rescuers could breach the inner doors. As the roar of the incoming liquid stone echoed through the vents, Miller managed to swing a heavy fire axe, the blade biting into the base of a support pillar near the mezzanine. The gallery began to tilt, the statues of the smiling dead sliding toward the rising tide of chemicals, and Sebastian Thorne gripped the railing, his knuckles white, realizing that his gallery of eternal laughter was about to become his own inescapable, hardening grave. The subterranean gallery groaned under the weight of the Nevada desert as the final purge turned the chamber into a pressurized tomb of liquid stone. Sebastian Thorne stood atop the shaking mezzanine, his knuckles white as he gripped the brass railing, watching his life's work, his silent, smiling congregation beholden to the chaotic physics of a dying structure. The translucent polymer, a viscous tide of synthetic amber, surged from the floor vents with a predatory hiss, swallowing the ankles of the frozen dancers and the petrified gamblers. Miller's MI6 team were shadows moving through a fog of chemical steam and concrete dust, their tactical lights cutting through the gloom like scalpels. Sebastian didn't see them as law enforcement. He saw them as vandals, Philistines smudging the ink on a masterpiece that had taken a decade to compose. The floor tilted at a sickening 15-degree angle, causing the screaming debutante, a statue of a girl whose vocal cords he had personally severed before the freezing process, to slide across the marble floor, her fixed, horrific grin reflecting the strobe-like flashes of gunfire. The curator felt a searing heat rising from the reservoirs below, the exothermic reaction of the polymer beginning to cook the very air, turning the room into a kiln where flesh and plastic would soon fuse into an eternal, singular monument to his genius and the world's cruelty. Miller breached the inner sanctum, his face a mask of sweat and soot, his weapon leveled at the man who had turned London's grief into a Vegas spectacle. But Sebastian Thorne did not flinch. He moved with the practiced, eerie calm of a man who had spent more time with the dead than the living. He adjusted his silk cravat, the silver tie-pin glinting under the emergency red floodlights, while the world literally dissolved around him. "You think you are saving them, Agent Miller?" Sebastian's voice was a low, melodic rasp that carried over the roar of the encroaching liquid. "Look at them. They are perfect. They are immune to the rot of time, the infidelity of the heart, and the indignity of aging. I have given them the only thing God refused: permanence." He slammed a secondary override on the console, and a heavy iron gate dropped between him and the tactical team, a cage of his own making. The polymer was now waist-deep in the lower gallery, a clear, hardening sea where the victim's eyes, though still capable of movement, darted in a frenzied, silent plea for a death that Sebastian had denied them. He watched a billionaire's statue tip over, the polymer encasing the body like a giant's teardrop, preserving the man's final moment of avarice-induced terror for a future that might never find it. The transformation was not merely environmental, it was becoming internal as the fumes of the polymer began to coat Sebastian's own lungs, a sweet, cloying taste of his own medicine. He felt the wiry strength in his ectomorphic frame tighten, a manic surge of adrenaline overriding the refined sensibilities of the Mayfair embalmer. He reached for a heavy glass canister of the catalyst, holding it over the main vat like a dark priest preparing a baptism. The structural integrity of the casino above finally gave way, a massive support beam crashing through the ceiling and impaling a row of the laughing waiters, shattering their polymer shells and spilling their preserved, desiccated remains into the muck. Sebastian let out a jagged, aristocratic cry of mourning. The grit of the desert was contaminating the purity of his medium. His pale, parchment-like skin was slick with the condensation of the chemical reaction, and for the first time, the professional line of his lips broke into a jagged, terrifying mirror of his victim's expressions. He realized that the gallery was no longer a place of exhibition. It was a sarcophagus, and the curator was the final artifact required to complete the collection. He began to dump the catalyst directly into the reservoir at his feet, the liquid beneath him beginning to churn and thicken with violent, bubbling speed. As the mezzanine supports buckled, Sebastian found himself face to face with the abyss he had spent his life decorating. Miller was screaming something, his voice muffled by the thick, oxygen-depleted air, but Sebastian was focused on the reflection in the rising pool of liquid stone. He saw the 48-year-old perfectionist, the man who had outrun the ghosts of London, only to build a temple for them in the sand. The polymer reached the edge of the platform, a warm, suffocating wave that promised the very stillness he had forced upon so many others. He didn't see it as a defeat. He saw it as the ultimate promotion. He would not die as a fugitive or a madman. He would become the centerpiece, the legend of the smiling man of Nevada. With a final, deliberate step, he moved toward the edge of the collapsing catwalk, his icy blue eyes fixed on the ceiling as it peeled away to reveal the cold, indifferent stars of the Vegas night. The floor gave way entirely, and as he began his descent into the boiling, translucent vat, he felt the first touch of the polymer against his Savile Row suit. A hardening, tightening embrace that began to lock his features into a final, triumphant grimace, just as the entire gallery was swallowed by the desert's shifting sands. The liquid was not a death. It was a coronation. As the vat swallowed his 6'1" frame, Sebastian Thorne felt the bespoke wool of his Savile Row suit, a masterpiece of charcoal tailoring, saturate with the warm, viscous polymer. It wasn't the searing heat he expected, but a heavy, rhythmic pressure, like the hand of a creator pressing into clay. The world of sound. The gunfire from Agent Miller, the groaning of the steel mezzanine, the distant, frantic sirens of the Las Vegas Metro Police faded into a muffled, thumping heartbeat. Beneath the surface, the curator was finally home. He watched through the translucent amber of the rising chemicals as the ceiling of his underground cathedral buckled. The desert began to pour in, a deluge of sand and grit that mixed with the blood and champagne of his final gala. He didn't blink. His icy blue eyes, framed by heavy lids that had seen 1,000 deaths in Mayfair, remained fixed on the collapsing reality above. He was the only still point in a turning world. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and agonizingly beautiful. The polymer seeped through the silk of his cravat, finding the pores of his pale, parchment-like skin. It began to harden, not just around him, but into him. Sebastian felt his muscles lock, his wiry strength surrendered to the ultimate preservation. This was the technique he had perfected on the dancers of the Strip and the high rollers of the casinos, now turned inward. His aquiline, sharp-edged nose felt the first touch of the internal freeze. His lungs, filled with the last breath of Vegas air, were suddenly encased in a glass-like shell. He could feel the silver tie pin against his chest, a cold anchor in the middle of a hardening sea. He didn't struggle. To struggle would be to ruin the composition. Instead, he willed his thin, precisely defined lips into the expression he had denied himself for 48 years, a genuine, hideous, triumphant grin. He was no longer a man. He was the definitive edition of his own dark philosophy. When the tactical teams finally breached the subterranean level 3 days later, the silence was more deafening than the explosion that had buried the entrance. Their flashlights cut through the dust-choked air, illuminating a forest of shadows. There, standing along the cracked marble corridors, were the guests. Hundreds of perfectly preserved figures, their faces locked in the eternal, agonizing smiles that had become the curator's signature. The MI6 agent, Miller, his shoulder bandaged and his eyes hollowed by what he had seen, led the way. They found the vat at the center of the ruins. The polymer had cooled into a jagged, translucent monolith. Inside, suspended like a prehistoric insect in amber, was Sebastian Thorne. He looked exactly as he had in London, the same military precision in his salt and pepper hair, the same aristocratic poise. But the eyes, those icy blue eyes, seemed to follow the flashlights. He was the smiling man of Nevada, a monument to the intersection of British refinement and American depravity. As the sun rose over the Nevada horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and gold, the desert began its slow process of erasure. The wind whipped the sand over the entrance to the tomb, filling the cracks and smoothing the jagged edges of the ruins. Within the depths, the polymer held firm. Sebastian Thorne was no longer a fugitive, no longer a mortician, and no longer a murderer. He was the curator of a gallery that would never close, a silent witness to the transience of life. His pale skin, his sharp features, and his bespoke tailoring were preserved in a state of grace that defied the laws of nature. The Gallery of Eternal Smiles had found its final, perfect acquisition. And as the last light of the day faded, the curator's icy blue eyes seemed to glint with a secret knowledge that in the end, everyone eventually joins the collection. The curator's smile is now eternal. Did he win, or is this the ultimate prison? Subscribe and like to support more high-stakes drama. Comment, smile if you enjoyed this finale. Tune in for a brand new series tomorrow at 2 p.m.